I am Diana, 31 years old, and until recently, I had completely stopped looking for love. So when I married a struggling single dad who drove a beat-up 2004 Ford Taurus, my family treated it as the ultimate punchline. They had no idea that just 5 days after our wedding, this supposedly broke man would hand me a debit card and tell me to buy whatever I wanted. Or that when I went to the bank, the teller would check my ID, turn pale, and whisper, "He never told you." Before I reveal the secret that destroyed my toxic family, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to relatives who underestimated your worth. Growing up, I was the designated scapegoat. My parents, Thomas and Cynthia, idolized my older sister Brittany, treating her every mediocre achievement as absolute genius, while dismissing my entire career as a high school literature teacher. When I introduced them to Ian, a quiet, 35-year-old single father, to my 10-year-old student, Leo, their disdain was immediate and suffocating. Ian wore faded thrift store shirts and drove a rusty sedan that sputtered loudly whenever it started. To my family of status-obsessed snobs, he was an unforgivable embarrassment. Our wedding reception was a tiny budget-friendly gathering in a rented community hall. We could not afford much, but Ian looked at me with such genuine devotion that the paper plates and cheap folding chairs did not matter to me at all. That fragile peace lasted exactly until my brother-in-law Jamal decided it was time for a toast. Jamal is an African-American investment bank credit director who loves wearing tailored suits that cost more than my annual salary. He married my sister Brittany 5 years ago, and they truly are a match made in arrogant heaven. Jamal stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne glass. The room quieted down immediately. He looked at Ian, then at me, flashing a brilliant predatory smile. To the happy couple, Jamal announced, his deep voice carrying easily across the small, quiet room. "Diana, we all knew you would settle eventually, but we honestly did not think you would settle for a guy whose car is held together by duct tape and prayers." Brittany giggled loudly from the head table. My parents simply smirked, sipping their drinks. Jamal reached into his expensive jacket, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and casually tossed it onto our sweetheart table. It fluttered down, landing perfectly on my cheap paper napkin. "Here is a little charity donation," Jamal said, his eyes gleaming with open mockery. "Put it toward a gas station honeymoon. You will definitely need it to jumpstart that pathetic Ford Taurus." My face burned with intense, overwhelming humiliation. The handful of guests stared in awkward, suffocating silence. I looked at Ian, expecting him to shrink in shame or get angry, but he just sat there, his expression remarkably calm, almost entirely unbothered by the cruel insult. I tried desperately to salvage the evening by asking my parents to join us for a quick family photo. My mother Cynthia actually stepped back in horror, smoothing her designer dress to avoid touching me. "Absolutely not," she scoffed loudly enough for half the room to hear clearly. "I am not having my friends see me standing next to a man who looks like he just crawled out of a homeless shelter. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family, Diana." I swallowed my tears and finished my wedding night pretending their cruelty did not slowly suffocate my spirit. I truly thought the worst was over. I thought we could just retreat to our quiet life and ignore them. I was completely wrong. The real nightmare began exactly 3 days later. Ian and I, along with little Leo, were living in my late grandmother's cozy, modest house. It was the only place in the world where I felt safe, though technically the property deed was still entirely controlled by my parents. I was making warm pancakes for Leo before school when I heard a loud, aggressive pounding at the front door. When I opened it, I found Thomas, Cynthia, Brittany, and Jamal standing aggressively on my porch. They did not even bother to say hello. Jamal simply stepped forward and shoved a thick, legally binding document hard into my chest. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling violently as I looked down at the official stamp on the paper. "An eviction notice," my father Thomas stated coldly, showing absolutely no emotion. "You have exactly 72 hours to pack up your pathetic little family and get off our property." I stared at them in absolute paralyzing shock. "You are kicking me out. Where are we supposed to go? Leo has school." We do not have the money for a deposit on a new place right now. Brittany crossed her arms, rolling her eyes dramatically. That sounds like a you problem, Diana. Jamal and I are hiring contractors next week. We are bulldozing this rotting shack to build a luxury summer vacation rental. We cannot have you squatting here and ruining our investment timeline. I felt the air violently leave my lungs. You are tearing down Grandma's house. For a vacation rental. I turned to my mother, desperate for just a single shred of maternal compassion. Mom, please. Ian gets paid in 2 weeks. Just give us a little more time so Leo does not end up sleeping in a freezing car. Cynthia stepped forward, her eyes entirely devoid of warmth or love. She looked at me like I was a disgusting stranger begging for spare change. You chose to marry a broke loser, Diana, she said, her voice dripping with pure venom. So go live in the slums where you belong. This land is for people who actually make something of themselves. You made your bed with that trash. Now go sleep in it on the cold street. They turned around and walked back to Jamal's gleaming luxury SUV, leaving me standing alone in the doorway clutching the eviction notice. As they drove away, I stumbled out to the driveway and collapsed against the steering wheel of Ian's rusty Ford Taurus. I buried my face in my trembling hands, sobbing uncontrollably. I had wanted a beautiful life, but instead I had just dragged a wonderful man and an innocent child straight into absolute homelessness. The cold metal of the steering wheel bit into my forehead as I tried to steady my breathing. The sheer cruelty of my own parents handing me an eviction notice just 3 days after my wedding echoed in the cramped interior of Ian's ancient Ford Taurus. I lifted my head and stared through the cracked windshield at the small, cozy house my grandmother had left behind. She had always promised this sanctuary would be mine, a safe haven from Thomas and Cynthia's relentless ambition. But she had passed away before transferring the deed, leaving my parents in absolute legal control. Now they were ripping away the only home I had ever known simply to punish me for choosing love over money. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, forcing myself to take deep, shaky breaths. The clock was already ticking down the 72 hours Jamal had so gleefully announced. I had to face Ian. I had to tell my new husband that because of me, he and his 10-year-old son were about to be thrown onto the street. Pushing open the heavy front door, I found Ian standing in the kitchen. He wore a faded gray shirt, calmly washing the breakfast dishes while humming a soft tune. The morning sunlight caught the slight gray at his temples, making him look so peaceful and entirely unaware of the storm that had just destroyed our lives. He turned, a warm smile spreading across his face, but it vanished the second he saw my red, swollen eyes. He dropped the dish towel and crossed the room in 2 long strides. His large, calloused hands gently framed my face. He asked me what was wrong, his voice thick with immediate concern. I could not find the words. My throat tightened painfully as I shoved the crumpled legal document against his chest. Ian unfolded the eviction notice. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the panic, the anger, or the regret of marrying a woman with such a toxic family. I expected him to shout or pace the room in despair. Instead, a heavy, unsettling silence filled the kitchen. When I finally opened my eyes, Ian was not looking at the paper with fear. His jaw was clenched tight, and a cold, sharp intensity flashed in his dark eyes. It was a look of absolute authority, a fleeting shadow of someone powerful, completely unlike the struggling single father I thought I knew. But the expression vanished so quickly I thought my tear-filled eyes had imagined it. He pulled me firmly into his chest, wrapping his arms around my shaking shoulders. He kissed the top of my head and spoke with a low, steady voice that carried absolutely zero panic. "We will be fine, Diana. Do not waste another tear on them. I will handle this." His calm reassurance only made me cry harder. How could he handle this? He worked odd hours, drove a car that barely ran, and devoted all his spare time to raising Leo. He had no savings to pull us out of a sudden eviction, but I nodded against his chest, wanting to believe him. The next 48 hours were a blur of exhausting, heartbreaking labor. We scrounged for free cardboard boxes behind local grocery stores and began dismantling our lives. Taking down my grandmother's floral curtains felt like erasing her memory. Packing up Leo's small collection of science books and action figures shattered my heart. I was a high school literature teacher. I worked long hours grading essays late into the night, but my modest salary barely covered our daily living expenses. I spent every spare second frantically scrolling through local rental listings on my phone. Everything required a massive security deposit, first and last month's rent, and immediate credit checks. We had nothing close to the cash required to secure a roof over our heads. My family made sure the countdown was as agonizing as possible. My phone constantly buzzed with their venom. Jamal sent a text message containing a photo of a bright yellow bulldozer. The caption read, "TikTok, I hope you packed comfortable walking shoes." Brittany chimed in an hour later on a group text that included my parents. "You should have married a real man. Have fun navigating the homeless shelter intake forms. Try not to track mud into the house when you leave." I blocked their numbers, throwing my phone onto the mattress we were about to strip. I felt a deep, burning shame. I was supposed to be a protector, a new mother figure to Leo, but I was failing spectacularly. Ian remained remarkably stoic throughout the entire ordeal. While I boxed up the kitchen, I caught him stepping out onto the back porch to make hushed phone calls. I assumed he was begging his previous landlords for a favor or asking for extra shifts at whatever manual labor job he was currently working. He spoke in clipped, authoritative tones, pacing the wooden deck with his phone pressed hard against his ear. Whenever he caught me watching, he would quickly soften his posture, offer a reassuring smile, and return to taping up boxes. On the afternoon of the second day, Leo came home from school. He dropped his backpack in the hallway, looking around at the bare walls and stacked boxes with wide, confused eyes. I knelt down in front of him, fighting the desperate urge to break down crying. I gently explained that the owners of the house needed it back, carefully, omitting the fact that the owners were his new grandparents, who viewed him as trash. Leo stared at the floor for a moment, then reached out and hugged my neck. He told me he did not care where we lived as long as we stayed together. His innocent, pure acceptance felt heavier than any insult my family had hurled at me. I would never let this child sleep on the cold street. Morning broke on the 5th day of my marriage. We had less than 24 hours before my family would drag us out of the house. The cardboard boxes against the walls looked like a monument to my failure. I sat at the kitchen table while Ian and Leo were asleep. The house was freezing because I had turned off the heating to save a few dollars. I pulled my faded sweater tighter around my shoulders and stared at my phone screen. The blue light illuminated my face as I navigated through predatory payday loan websites. The terms were sickening. High interest rates and hidden fees would trap us in poverty for years, but I had no options. I needed cash for a security deposit on the cheapest apartment I could find. Every legitimate bank had rejected my urgent applications due to my modest teacher salary and lack of collateral. My finger hovered over a red button that read, "Submit application." I felt nausea crash into my stomach. Clicking that button meant selling our future to loan sharks, but refusing meant Leo would sleep on the sidewalk. I squeezed my eyes shut, cursing my parents and sister for putting us in this position. I cursed my brother-in-law for his arrogant cruelty, but mostly I blamed myself for being powerless to stop them. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. I locked my phone screen and wiped my eyes, pretending to inspect a taped-up moving box. Ian walked into the kitchen wearing a plain white undershirt and worn denim jeans. He poured a cup of leftover coffee, drinking it black. He did not say a word. He stood by the counter, his dark eyes studying my rigid posture and the frantic way I clutched my phone. The air felt thick with the terror of our eviction. I forced an entirely fake smile onto my face. I told him I was looking at rental properties and that we had solid options for tomorrow. Ian set his coffee mug down with a quiet thud. He walked over to the table and pulled out the wooden chair opposite mine. He sat down and reached across the scratched table, placing his large hand directly over my trembling fingers. He knew I was lying. He always knew when I was trying to shoulder a burden on my own. "You are looking at those high-interest loan sites again," he said. His voice was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with an unnerving calmness that contrasted with the sheer panic consuming my brain. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the lie died in my throat. I confessed everything. I told him we were out of time and options. I explained that I needed to secure a temporary motel room by this afternoon, or we would have nowhere to go when the bulldozer arrived tomorrow morning. I braced myself for his panic, waiting for him to crack under the immense pressure my family had placed on his shoulders. Instead, Ian reached into the back pocket of his faded jeans and pulled out a worn leather wallet. The edges were frayed, looking exactly like something a struggling single father would carry. He opened it slowly. He did not pull out a wad of cash or a stack of maxed-out credit cards. He reached into a hidden slot and pulled out a single card. He slid it across the wooden table toward me. The card stopped in front of my hands. I stared at it in profound confusion. It was matte black. There were no bank logos, no standard issue chip designs, and no embossed numbers running across the front. It looked like a solid, smooth piece of dark metal. When I hesitantly reached out and picked it up, the physical weight of the card shocked me. It was unusually heavy, cold to the touch, and felt different from any piece of plastic I had ever held. "Buy whatever you want," Ian told me. I looked up from the heavy black metal and met his eyes. His gaze was steady and unbattered by our desperate reality. I assumed he was offering me a prepaid debit card or a secured credit card he kept for emergencies. I figured he had managed to stash away maybe $500 over the past year. It was barely enough to cover a week at a roadside motel, but right now, $500 felt like a winning lottery ticket. I asked him if he was sure we should use his emergency stash. I promised him I would pay back every single cent as soon as my next paycheck cleared the school district payroll. I told him I would drive down the highway right now and find a cheap motel room with a weekly rate so we could get our boxes out before my family arrived. Ian did not blink. He just gave me a soft, reassuring nod. He told me to go take care of the housing situation while he finished packing up Leo's bedroom. He repeated his instruction, emphasizing every word with a strange, quiet power. "Buy whatever you want, Diana." I slipped the heavy black card into my coat pocket, feeling a spark of relief break through my overwhelming despair. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door, deeply grateful for my hardworking husband's meager savings. I had no idea I was carrying a financial weapon that was about to obliterate my entire understanding of reality. I climbed into the rusted Ford Taurus and started the loud engine. I backed out of the driveway, unaware that my quick trip to the local bank branch was going to trigger an explosive chain of events. I drove toward the commercial district, calculating how many nights of shelter we could squeeze out of a few $100, blind to the earth-shattering secret waiting for me at the teller window. The severely rusted muffler of the heavy Ford Taurus scraped against the cold asphalt as I pulled into the sprawling downtown financial district. Glass skyscrapers cast imposing shadows over the busy streets, making me feel smaller than my family already had. I navigated the sputtering car into a spot outside one of the city's most elite banking institutions. My hands were slick with cold sweat. Inside my coat pocket, the matte black metal card felt like a burning ember. I had no idea if this mysterious card would work or trigger a humiliating fraud alert, but I was out of options. I needed $2,000 today to secure a cheap rental unit. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the immaculate sidewalk. The contrast between my harsh reality and the wealthy world inside the bank was instantly suffocating. I pushed through the glass doors and was hit by the scent of expensive cologne and fresh leather. The interior was a vast expanse of gleaming white marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and quiet murmurs. Men in tailored wool suits and women carrying designer handbags moved gracefully past me. I stood awkwardly in the grand lobby, acutely aware of my faded sweater, dusty jeans, and the dark circles bruised under my eyes. I felt like an absolute intruder, a desperate beggar trespassing in a sanctuary built exclusively for people like my arrogant brother-in-law Jamal. A uniformed security guard eyed me suspiciously from his post near the entrance. I lowered my head, forcing my trembling legs to walk steadily toward the teller windows. I joined the velvet-roped line, rehearsing the transaction in my head. I would ask for $2,000, sign whatever withdrawal slip was required, and get out of this intimidating place as quickly as humanly possible. When it was finally my turn, I stepped up to a window staffed by a meticulously groomed woman with a sharp, calculating gaze. She looked me up and down, her polite smile not quite reaching her eyes. She clearly registered my cheap clothes and exhausted appearance, silently placing me in the category of a nuisance customer asking for quarters. I kept my voice steady, politely asking to withdraw $2,000. I pulled out the solid black metal card and slid it across the marble counter. The teller picked it up, her manicured fingers, pausing as the unexpected weight of the metal registered. She flipped the dark card over in her hands, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. There were no embossed account numbers, no microchip designs, and no bank logos printed anywhere on the sleek surface. She looked back up at me, the condescending edge in her demeanor sharpening into active suspicion. She asked for my photo identification, her tone crisp and demanding, clearly expecting me to hand over a stolen ID. I quickly retrieved my driver's license and my newly printed marriage certificate, explaining that my husband had given me the card for an emergency. She snatched the documents, scrutinizing my face against the plastic ID before turning to her computer terminal. She swiped the heavy black metal through a specialized card reader attached to her keyboard. The machine beeped once. The software prompted her for security clearance. She typed rapidly, verifying my legal status. I held my breath, my fingernails digging painfully into my palms. I was terrified that the screen would flash red, indicating insufficient funds or a frozen account. I braced myself for the humiliation of being turned away, calculating how much I could pawn my old laptop for. Instead, the teller stopped typing. Her hands froze, completely suspended in midair above the keyboard. I watched in mounting horror as every drop of color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickening, ghostly white. Her mouth fell open in a silent gasp. She stared at the monitor as if looking directly at a loaded weapon. Her polished composure shattered into absolute panic. Her hands began to tremble so violently that her gold bracelets rattled against the marble counter. Before I could ask what was wrong, she slammed her hand down on a red security key, locking down her terminal. My heart hammered frantically against my ribs. I leaned forward, apologizing profusely, begging her not to confiscate the card, swearing that my husband was just a hard-working single dad who might have accidentally overdrawn his savings. She completely ignored my desperate apologies. Breathing heavily, she snatched the desk phone from its cradle, her shaking fingers fumbling as she dialed a 3-digit internal extension. She spoke into the receiver in a frantic, hushed whisper, demanding the branch manager come to window 4 immediately. She hung up the phone with a sharp clatter and slowly turned her head back to face me. The condescending suspicion was entirely gone, replaced by a mixture of awe, terror, and raw disbelief. She leaned across the wide marble counter, bringing her face inches from mine. She looked deep into my eyes, her voice quivering violently as she whispered the words that would alter my reality forever. "He never told you," she breathed out, her eyes wide with shock. "Told me what?" I asked, my voice cracking under the pressure of the moment. I leaned forward, shifting my weight, and caught a brief, fleeting glimpse of the locked monitor screen angled slightly toward the glass partition. The secure interface displayed a primary account holder profile. Below Ian's name in bold green numbers was the total available cash balance. It was not a few $100s. It was not a few thousand. It was a staggering, impossibly long string of numbers that stretched across the screen. Hundreds of millions of dollars. 9 figures sitting idly in a liquid checking account. My brain violently rejected the visual information. The man who drove a rusted Ford Taurus, the man who wore faded thrift store jeans and calmly washed dishes in a tiny, cramped kitchen, was sitting on a mountain of unimaginable, limitless wealth. The heavy silence in the bank was shattered by the sharp sound of the heavy glass entrance doors swinging violently open. I could not pull my eyes away from the impossible string of green numbers on the monitor until a sudden shift in the room's atmosphere forced me to turn. The branch manager was already sprinting across the marble floor, his face pale with panic, but he froze midway. Ian stepped into the grand lobby. I was still wearing the same faded denim and worn undershirt from our kitchen, but the man walking toward me was a complete stranger. His posture was rigid, commanding absolute authority, and his dark eyes swept the room with predatory precision. Flanking him were 2 massive men in tailored suits, their discreet earpieces marking them as professional security. The entire bank fell dead silent. The arrogant patrons parted like the Red Sea as Ian strode directly to window 4. The branch manager hastily bowed his head, stammering apologies about the security protocol. Ian ignored him entirely. He reached across the marble counter, his large hand smoothly retrieving the matte black metal card from the trembling teller. Without a single word, he placed his other hand firmly on the small of my back. His touch was warm and grounding, anchoring me as my reality spun wildly out of control. He guided me away from the teller window, leading me straight out of the stunned financial institution. I expected him to walk me back to the rusted Ford Taurus. Instead, a sleek, heavily armored black SUV idled smoothly at the curb, blocking the lane. One of the security men quickly opened the rear door. Ian ushered me inside the luxurious leather interior, climbing in right behind me. The heavy doors shut with a solid pressurized thud, instantly sealing us off from the noisy city streets behind pitch-black tinted glass. I sat frozen against the pristine upholstery, clutching my cheap coat, unable to form a single coherent sentence. The driver navigated seamlessly through the busy financial district, pulling into a highly secured private underground garage beneath the city's tallest glass skyscraper. We bypassed the main lobby, entirely stepping into a private elevator, requiring biometric access. The high-speed car shot upward, my stomach dropping as the floor numbers blurred past. When the chrome doors parted, I stepped into a breathtaking massive penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the entire skyline. Exquisite modern art lined the walls, and the minimalist furniture easily cost more than my grandmother's entire estate. Ian gently guided me to a plush velvet sofa, sitting closely beside me. He took my trembling hands in his, looking deep into my eyes with an expression of profound regret and undeniable relief. He finally confessed the truth. The man who had courted me over budget coffee and park dates was the ultra-secretive founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Horizon, a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm that effectively controlled half the regional economy. My mind struggled to process the magnitude of his words. Jamal, my arrogant brother-in-law, worshipped Vanguard Horizon, viewing the firm as the absolute pinnacle of corporate power. Now, the CEO of that very empire was sitting next to me in a faded shirt, holding my hands. Ian explained his deception with a raw, agonizing honesty. After his first wife passed away, his immense wealth had attracted a relentless swarm of opportunistic gold diggers, corporate sharks, and fake friends. His son Leo became a target for ruthless social climbers. Terrified of raising his boy in a toxic, superficial environment, Ian created a second life. He bought the rusted Ford, rented a modest apartment in my neighborhood, and actively sought a partner who would love him for his character, not his bank accounts. He told me how deeply my genuine kindness had moved him, and how I had loved Leo without ever expecting a dime in return. He swore he had planned to reveal his true identity shortly after our wedding, wanting us to settle into married life first, but my family's vicious, sudden eviction notice had forced his hand. He could not let me suffer through the panic of impending homelessness for another second. I sat quietly on the velvet sofa, letting the massive weight of his confession settle over me. Anger would have been the standard reaction. I had a right to be furious about the lie. Yet as I looked at the man who had desperately shielded his son from the exact type of greedy, status-obsessed monsters I called my family, I felt absolutely no anger. Instead, a profound, razor-sharp clarity began to crystallize in my mind. My parents and my sister had thrown me away like garbage because they measured human worth exclusively by wealth. They had gleefully orchestrated my eviction, mocking my supposed poverty to elevate their own pathetic egos. If they knew the truth right now, if they knew my husband could buy and sell Jamal's entire investment bank before lunch, they would instantly drop to their knees. They would fake tearful apologies, shower us with sickening affection, and relentlessly scheme to exploit Ian's capital for their failing real estate ventures. I squeezed Ian's hands tightly, looking into his anxious eyes. I told him I completely understood his reasons and forgave him for the deception. I saw the massive tension leave his broad shoulders as he let out a shaky breath. But then I made a request that surprised him. I asked him to keep his identity hidden from my family. I recognized the ultimate devastating advantage I now held in my hands. Revealing the truth today would only give them a chance to adapt. By continuing to play the penniless evicted outcast, I would become entirely invisible to their radar. It was the absolute perfect camouflage to orchestrate a flawless, inescapable trap, allowing me to dismantle their toxic empire from the inside out while they were blinded by their own arrogance. The jarring screech of Ian's rusted Ford Taurus echoed through quiet suburban streets as I drove to the high school. My fingers gripped the cracked steering wheel, but my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. Knowing the man I loved possessed enough wealth to buy the entire city block gave me an intoxicating sense of armor. I parked the sputtering vehicle in the staff lot, entirely committed to maintaining my flawless cover. I would play the role of the penniless outcast to absolute perfection, letting my family drown in their arrogance until the trap snapped shut. During the lunch break, I sat at a cramped table in the crowded staff lounge. I quietly reviewed lesson plans while eating a modest sandwich. Mr. Mitchell, our strict principal, stood near the coffee machine discussing upcoming district assessments. The atmosphere was calm and entirely routine until the heavy double doors of the faculty lounge were violently shoved open. The loud bang caused the entire room to fall dead silent. I looked up and felt my blood run cold. My mother, Cynthia, and my golden child sister, Brittany, marched into the room like invading royalty. Cynthia wore a pristine white designer coat. Brittany followed closely behind, dragging a massive, filthy cardboard box that looked like it had been pulled directly from a dumpster. They had absolutely no business barging into a restricted staff area. Mr. Mitchell stepped forward immediately, a severe frown forming on his face as he asked them to identify themselves. Cynthia completely ignored him. She scanned the room with absolute disdain until her eyes locked onto me sitting in the corner. Her lips curled into a vicious, triumphant smirk. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my table, her voice ringing out loudly enough for every teacher in the room to hear. "There is the charity case," Cynthia announced, her tone dripping with mock sympathy. I froze in my plastic chair, my cheeks flushing as dozens of confused eyes turned toward me. Brittany dragged the heavy dirt-streaked box across the room, shoving it hard against my table. "We brought you some emergency relief," Diana Brittany declared loudly, placing her hands on her hips. "Since you and that broke loser you married got yourselves evicted, we knew you could not possibly afford to clothe his child. We gathered up some donations so your new stepson does not have to walk around looking like a homeless beggar." A collective gasp rippled through the faculty lounge. My colleagues exchanged horrified glances, completely stunned by the blatant cruelty unfolding in their sanctuary. Mr. Mitchell marched over, demanding that they leave the premises immediately. Cynthia simply held up a hand, completely unbothered by his authority. "We are performing a public service," Cynthia proclaimed, reaching into the filthy cardboard box. "We simply cannot allow my daughter to bring shame to our family name by letting that 10-year-old boy wear rags." She pulled out a severely stained, moth-eaten sweater that smelled strongly of mildew and aggressively tossed it onto my lesson plans. Brittany joined in, digging into the box and pulling out a pair of torn, muddy sneakers with holes in the soles. She dropped them onto the table with a loud thud. "We found these in the garage," she sneered, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "They are practically garbage, but they are a massive upgrade from whatever trash your husband buys. You are welcome, by the way. Do not say we never did anything to support your pathetic marriage." The sheer audacity of their ambush was breathtaking. They had actively driven across town, bypassed school security, and crashed a private faculty lounge strictly to humiliate me in front of my peers and my boss. They wanted to strip away my professional dignity and display my supposed poverty as a cautionary tale. My coworkers watched in stunned silence, too shocked by the sheer toxicity to intervene. I looked down at the stained, foul-smelling clothes resting on my graded papers. My hands trembled not from shame, but from the immense effort it took to suppress a burst of victorious laughter. My mother and sister were standing, radiating arrogant superiority, entirely unaware that my husband held a black metal card with a 9-figure balance. They were loudly boasting about donating literal garbage to a child who was the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar venture capital empire. I slowly stood up from my plastic chair, looking directly into my mother's cold, calculating eyes. I forced my voice to tremble, playing the part of the broken, humiliated victim flawlessly. I thanked them for their generosity, my tone barely above a whisper. I told them I appreciated the dirty clothes and would make sure Leo knew exactly where they came from. Cynthia let out a sharp laugh, clearly thrilled by my submission. "Enjoy the slums, Diana," she called over her shoulder as she walked toward the exit. "Try not to drag the school's reputation down with you." Brittany offered one final smirk before following our mother out the heavy double doors. The doors swung shut, plunging the faculty lounge back into a suffocating, awkward silence. Mr. Mitchell approached my table, his expression tight with profound sympathy and professional concern. He gently offered to help me carry the box to my car. I politely declined his offer quietly, gathering the filthy clothes and placing them back into the dirty cardboard box. I carried the heavy box out of the lounge, maintaining my defeated posture until I reached the hallway. As I walked alone toward the dumpster behind the cafeteria, the trembling in my hands finally stopped. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. They had taken the bait perfectly. Their ravenous hunger to assert dominance had blinded them completely. I tossed the box of garbage into the metal dumpster, my mind already calculating the devastating moves ahead. The trap was set. The heavy metal doors of the main office swung shut behind me, sealing me inside a small room that felt uncomfortably cold. It was barely 8 o'clock. The school secretary avoided my gaze entirely, pointing a trembling finger toward the principal's office. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, thick with an unspoken dread. I knocked twice on the frosted glass door. Mr. Mitchell called for me to enter. When I stepped into the windowless office, the sheer gravity of the situation hit me. Mr. Mitchell was not alone. Seated across from his desk was Richard, a stern school board administrator who rarely visited unless an educator faced disciplinary action. Mr. Mitchell looked completely exhausted. Dark shadows bruised skin under his eyes. He gestured for me to sit down in the rigid plastic chair opposite his desk. I took my seat, keeping my posture perfectly straight, my mind racing. "Diana, we have a very difficult situation to discuss," Mr. Mitchell began, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. He pulled a thin manila folder from a stack of paperwork and slid it across the polished wood. His hands were shaking slightly. "As you know, our district relies heavily on private corporate sponsorships to fund our advanced literature programs and our extracurricular activities. Without these vital financial injections, we simply cannot keep our doors open." Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Yesterday afternoon, our district superintendent received a highly aggressive phone call from one of our most prominent financial backers. The call came from the director of credit at the city's largest investment bank. He made it absolutely clear that his institution would immediately sever all philanthropic ties and cancel their massive annual grants if we did not comply with a specific non-negotiable demand." My blood ran ice cold. The director of credit at the city's largest investment bank, Jamal. My arrogant brother-in-law had decided humiliating me with filthy clothes was not enough. He wanted total destruction. He wanted to strip away my entire livelihood and watch me beg for mercy. What was his demand, I asked, forcing my voice to remain completely steady and devoid of emotion. Mr. Mitchell finally looked up, his eyes filled with agonizing regret. "He demanded your immediate termination, Diana. He claimed you were an unstable liability who was deeply drowning in toxic personal debt and facing a messy eviction. He told the superintendent that having someone of your supposed low moral character interacting with impressionable students was a massive liability for their corporate brand image. He threatened to pull $3 million in crucial funding by the end of the business day if you were still employed here tomorrow morning." The sheer scale of Jamal's malice echoed in the cramped office. He was wielding his corporate leverage like a lethal weapon, fully prepared to financially cripple an entire public school district, just to enforce his petty, vindictive dominance over my life. He knew teaching was my absolute passion. He was actively trying to crush my spirit, hoping to break me down so entirely that I would have no choice but to crawl back to my toxic family on my hands and knees. Richard tapped his manicured finger against the manila folder. We fought against it, Diana. Mr. Mitchell vehemently defended your flawless teaching record. We consulted our legal team to see if we could block this clear extortion. But the brutal reality is that our district simply cannot afford to lose $3 million. That funding pays the salaries of 20 other teachers. It keeps the cafeteria running for low-income students. Our hands are completely tied behind our backs. We are officially terminating your teaching contract, effective immediately under the guise of sudden district budget cuts. They were firing me. My career, my passion, my daily routine all ripped away in an instant by a single malicious phone call from a man who despised me for choosing to marry a supposedly broke single father. The blatant injustice of the situation was sickening. The school board was sacrificing my entire livelihood on the altar of corporate greed, bowing to the tyrannical whims of a man who bullied his own family for sport. I looked down at the termination papers inside the manila folder. In any other reality, this moment would have destroyed me. I would have broken down into hysterical tears pleading for my job so Ian, Leo, and I would not starve. But I was not the penniless outcast Jamal believed me to be. I was the wife of the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Horizon. I had a matte black metal card in my pocket that held enough liquid capital to buy Jamal's entire investment bank in cash. Jamal had just handed me the perfect excuse to dedicate my focus to orchestrating his downfall. I picked up the plastic pen resting on Mr. Mitchell's desk. I did not cry or offer a word of protest. With chilling calmness, I signed my name on the dotted line legally terminating my employment. I closed the folder and slid it across the desk. Mr. Mitchell stared in profound shock, clearly expecting an emotional breakdown. I stood up, smoothing my faded sweater. I thanked them for their time, my voice ringing with undeniable authority. I told them I understood their difficult position and wished the district luck with their corporate sponsorships. I turned and walked out of the office, my head held high. As I marched down the hallway, the warning bell rang. I walked out into the crisp morning air, feeling an intoxicating wave of liberation wash over my body. Jamal thought he had won the ultimate victory. He thought he had severed my final lifeline, leaving me destitute and desperate. He had no idea. He had just unleashed a highly calculated, unstoppable force of nature that was about to systematically dismantle his entire existence. The game had officially changed, and I was holding all the winning cards. The drive back to the hidden downtown penthouse felt remarkably tranquil. I navigated the sputtering Ford Taurus through the morning traffic, feeling absolutely no anxiety over losing my teaching career. When the private armored car deposited me directly into our massive living room, Ian was already waiting. He sat at the expansive marble dining table reviewing global market reports on a secure tablet. I set my keys down and calmly informed him that my employment contract had just been forcefully terminated. I detailed every single word of the malicious threat my arrogant brother-in-law had delivered to the district superintendent. Ian did not react with a simple display of anger. A terrifying absolute stillness fell over his entire body. His dark eyes hardened into pure, unyielding obsidian. He set his tablet down with a sharp, resonant clatter. Without uttering a single word, he reached for his secure, encrypted phone. He told me he was calling the Vanguard Horizon Acquisitions Division. He declared his immediate intention to initiate a ruthless, hostile takeover of Jamal's investment bank before lunch. He promised to financially annihilate the man, completely destroying his career and liquidating his assets by the end of the business day. I stepped forward and gently placed my hand directly over his phone. I asked him to wait. I looked into the eyes of the billionaire who was ready to wage corporate warfare strictly to defend my honor. I told him that crushing Jamal right now would be far too easy. Jamal needed to feel entirely invincible. He needed to believe his cruel extortion tactics had worked flawlessly, blinding him completely to the catastrophic trap we were about to build. Ian studied my face, sensing the cold, calculating resolve radiating from my posture. He slowly lowered the secure phone, yielding absolute control of the situation to me. Less than an hour later, my mobile device vibrated loudly against the cold marble counter. The caller identification screen displayed Brittany's name. I answered the call, maintaining a perfectly convincing tone of absolute defeat. My sister demanded my immediate presence at their newly constructed, excessively flashy suburban estate. She claimed the family had convened to discuss a permanent solution to my sudden, unfortunate unemployment. I agreed to the summons without hesitation. I hung up the phone and turned back to Ian, a sharp, dangerous smile spreading across my face. I told him I was walking straight into the lion's den strictly to see exactly how deep they were willing to dig their own graves. When I pulled up to their massive gated property, the sheer arrogance of their wealth was suffocating. Jamal and Brittany were waiting for me in the grand sweeping foyer. Jamal stood tall and commanding, his sharp, tailored suit emphasizing his powerful presence. As a highly successful African-American credit director, he prided himself on projecting absolute dominance in every single room he entered. He looked down at me with an expression of pure predatory satisfaction. I truly believed he had thoroughly crushed my entire existence. Brittany stepped forward carrying a cheap, flimsy cardboard box. She unceremoniously shoved it into my hands. I looked inside and saw a drab, severely outdated gray uniform. Jamal folded his arms across his broad chest, delivering his grand proposal. He informed me that my teaching career was permanently over. He boldly claimed I was a massive professional liability, entirely unemployable in any reputable district within the state. However, because they were such a deeply benevolent and forgiving family, they were willing to offer me an exclusive, highly gracious position. They proposed that I move into the cramped, windowless servants' quarters located above their detached garage. I would be required to work as their full-time, completely unpaid maid and nanny. I would scrub their marble floors, clean their luxury vehicles, and raise their future children. In exchange for this modern slavery, they would graciously provide basic leftover meals for me, Ian, and Leo. They framed this intensely degrading offer as a charitable opportunity for me to finally pay off my supposed debt to the family. They wanted me permanently trapped under their heavy boots, forced to witness their extravagant lifestyle while scrubbing dirt from their expensive designer shoes. My mother, Cynthia, descended the grand curved staircase, holding a sparkling crystal glass of expensive red wine. She nodded approvingly at the atrocious setup, telling me I should be falling to my trembling knees in profound gratitude. She sneered that my broke husband could easily find work mowing their extensive lawns. I stared down at the ugly gray uniform resting inside the cheap cardboard box. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of protest against their sickening cruelty. I simply looked up and met Jamal's arrogant gaze. A genuine freezing smile curved the corners of my mouth. I politely declined their highly generous charity. I turned on my heel and marched straight out the heavy mahogany doors. As I walked down the pristine driveway, I casually tossed the cardboard box containing their humiliating uniform directly into their oversized municipal dumpster. I drove straight back to the impenetrable security of our downtown penthouse. I bypassed the living room and walked directly into Ian's private executive office. I sat down in his heavy leather chair and logged into the highly classified Vanguard Horizon terminal. Armed with absolute executive clearance and unlimited corporate resources, I began a meticulous forensic analysis of the financial structure underlying Jamal's supposedly untouchable investment bank. The truth I uncovered was absolutely staggering. Jamal's specific credit division was severely overleveraged. He had approved massive amounts of high-risk, deeply toxic debt to artificially inflate his quarterly performance bonuses. The entire foundation of his banking empire was built on a fragile, crumbling house of cards. I flexed my fingers over the glowing mechanical keyboard. I did not launch a loud, aggressive attack. Instead, I quietly began executing a series of aggressive financial moves designed to completely annihilate him. The silent financial war I waged from the comfort of that plush leather chair took immense precision. Over the next 7 months, I used the limitless, highly classified resources of Vanguard Horizon to slowly suffocate the arrogant empire my family had built. It was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. I did not simply freeze their accounts. That would have been far too obvious. Instead, I carefully orchestrated a series of invisible, devastating economic shifts that directly targeted the heavily over-leveraged real estate ventures Thomas and Jamal had so proudly paraded around town. Jamal had always relied on his aggressive charm and his position as a powerful credit director to push through highly toxic, poorly secured loans. He believed he was an untouchable genius in the investment banking world. He had convinced my father to gamble everything on a massive commercial development. They planned to build a sprawling luxury shopping district, completely convinced it would elevate them to the absolute highest tier of the local elite. They poured millions of dollars into the project, using Jamal's banking influence to secure massive amounts of high-risk funding. I systematically dismantled their dream, brick by brick. Acting through several anonymous proxy firms controlled by Vanguard Horizon Y, I quietly bought up the underlying debt of their primary construction contractors. I subtly tightened the supply chain logistics, ensuring that raw materials for their vanity project were continuously delayed or hit with sudden exorbitant price increases. The construction site quickly turned into a stagnant, muddy wasteland of abandoned steel and idle excavators. As the project stalled, the massive interest rates on Jamal's toxic loans began to violently compound. The financial bleeding escalated rapidly, entirely hidden from the public eye, but painfully obvious to the men drowning in it. Thomas started losing his hair, his once confident posture deteriorating into a permanent anxious slump. He tried to project an image of absolute control during our brief forced family interactions, but the suffocating weight of his impending ruin was impossible to hide. Cynthia and Brittany remained completely oblivious. They continued to shop at high-end boutiques and boast about their upcoming luxury vacations, aggressively draining the very cash reserves Thomas was desperately trying to scrape together. Jamal was hit the hardest. The investment bank he worked for began conducting emergency internal audits. His superiors noticed the massive discrepancies in his credit division. The toxic loans he had approved for my father's development project were flagged as critically delinquent. The arrogant, commanding man who had thrown a $50 bill at my wedding table was now sweating through his expensive tailored suits. He was no longer just facing a simple bankruptcy. He had actively falsified financial projections and manipulated banking protocols to secure the funding for Thomas. Jamal was staring directly down the barrel of a federal prison sentence. Ian watched my meticulous campaign unfold with a mixture of profound admiration and silent awe. He never once interfered with my strategy. He simply stood behind me, offering his vast wealth and corporate power as the ultimate weapon for my retribution. Whenever I felt a brief, fleeting pang of guilt over destroying my own parents, Ian would gently remind me of the cold, unfeeling eviction notice they had shoved into my chest. He reminded me of the filthy, moth-eaten clothes they had dumped on my desk just to humiliate an innocent 10-year-old boy. My guilt evaporated instantly. As autumn approached, the situation for my family shifted from severe panic to absolute, undeniable desperation. The internal auditors at Jamal's bank issued a final, non-negotiable ultimatum. He had exactly 30 days to secure a massive influx of external capital to cover the toxic debt, or the bank would terminate his employment and hand his fraudulent files directly to the authorities. Thomas was equally trapped, facing complete asset seizure that would leave him and Cynthia entirely destitute. They were backed into a dark, suffocating corner with absolutely no way out. In a move born of pure desperation, Jamal set his sights on the ultimate financial lifeline. He needed a miracle, an impossibly wealthy angel investor who could instantly inject enough capital to bail out the failing commercial development and silence the bank auditors. He began frantically researching the most powerful, aggressively funded venture capital firms in the entire country. He completely bypassed the smaller local investors, knowing his fraudulent numbers would never pass their scrutiny. He needed a giant, an institution so massive that his multi-million-dollar debt would look like a simple rounding error. He set his sights firmly on Vanguard Horizon. I sat in the penthouse living room sipping a glass of red wine as I watched the highly secure internal alert flash across my encrypted tablet. Jamal had officially submitted a desperate urgent request for a meeting with the acquisitions team at Vanguard Horizon. He had attached a heavily doctored, highly optimistic portfolio of the failing real estate project, begging for a massive bailout investment. He wrote an obsequious, groveling cover letter addressed directly to the anonymous founder and chief executive officer of the firm. High praised the CEO's legendary business acumen, practically begging for the honor of a brief personal introduction. The sheer irony was utterly delicious. The man who had mocked my husband's rusted car, the man who had tried to enslave me as an unpaid nanny to pay off a fabricated family debt, was now virtually on his knees desperately praying for salvation from the very people he had tried to destroy. Jamal had no idea that the elusive billionaire CEO he was begging for mercy was Ian. He had no idea that his fraudulent, desperate proposal had bypassed the entire corporate hierarchy and landed directly on my glowing screen. He thought he was reaching out to a faceless corporate savior. He did not know he was knocking on the gates of his own personal hell, and I was holding the key. The bitter cold of late November bit through my coat as I parked Ian's sputtering Ford Taurus at the very end of a pristine driveway. Jamal and Brittany had recently moved into their newly constructed mansion in the exclusive suburb. The massive house was a monument to Jamal's ego built entirely on the fragile credit he manipulated. I stepped out wrapping a faded, oversized beige sweater tightly around my torso. I deliberately chose my cheapest clothing for this occasion. I was walking into their lavish Thanksgiving dinner, fully committed to playing the role of the broken, unemployed, utterly desperate scapegoat. The heavy oak door swung open before I could ring the bell. Brittany stood there holding a crystal glass of expensive champagne, wearing a silk dress that likely cost a month of my former teaching salary. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a vicious sneer. She offered no warm holiday greeting. She stepped aside, pointing a manicured finger toward the spotless kitchen. She informed me the caterers had dropped off the food, and since I currently contributed nothing to society, it was my job to plate appetizers and serve guests. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the hardwood floor, nodding meekly. I walked straight past the grand dining room where my parents were already seated, soaking in the opulent luxury. Cynthia wore a heavy pearl necklace, praising Jamal for providing such an exquisite holiday experience. Thomas nodded along, swirling a glass of dark bourbon, projecting the false confidence of a wealthy patriarch. They were desperately pretending their financial empire was not currently bleeding out from 1,000 invisible cuts. I tied a white apron over my sweater and began arranging expensive hors d'oeuvres onto silver platters. Carrying the heavy tray into the dining room, the suffocating atmosphere of arrogance hit me like a physical wall. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the imported porcelain dinnerware, highlighting the absurd extravagance they could no longer afford. Cynthia dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, projecting suburban royalty. Jamal sat at the head of the massive table. He wore a tailored suit, asserting his dominance. He took a shrimp from my tray, continuing a boastful conversation with my father. Thomas confidently sliced his premium steak, oblivious to the harsh reality that his unpaid contractors were aggressively preparing to file massive legal liens against his crumbling commercial construction sites. Jamal leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his champagne. He announced that their recent cash flow issues were about to vanish entirely. He puffed out his chest, declaring he had officially initiated contact with Vanguard Horizon. The sheer arrogance in his voice was staggering. He boasted he personally submitted a flawless investment portfolio directly to the firm's secretive chief executive officer. Jamal claimed that once this elusive billionaire reviewed his genius financial modeling, Vanguard Horizon would practically beg to inject a massive bailout into their stalled commercial real estate venture. I poured water into Cynthia's glass, keeping my hands steady. It took every ounce of willpower to suppress a triumphant smile. Jamal was boasting about his untouchable financial brilliance, completely unaware that the billionaire CEO he was desperately trying to woo was the very man he mocked relentlessly. Thomas raised his bourbon glass in a toast, praising his son-in-law for securing their legacy. He set his glass down, and finally turned his cold, calculating gaze toward me. He asked where my pathetic excuse for a husband was hiding today. I lowered my head, staring at the silver tray. I delivered the lie flawlessly. I told them Ian had to take a mandatory double shift at work just so we could afford to keep the heat on in our tiny rental unit for the winter. A cruel laugh erupted from Jamal's chest. He slapped the mahogany table, looking around at his captive audience. He loudly joked that my broke loser husband was probably scrubbing filthy toilets at a public bus station just to afford a generic brand turkey for his unfortunate kid. Brittany giggled viciously. She chimed in, saying it was an absolute tragedy Ian's son was being raised in such extreme squalor, destined to end up a miserable, uneducated failure just like his father. Every single bite they took tonight was financed by borrowed time and incredibly toxic credit. I maintained my silent, subservient facade, allowing their relentless insults to wash over me without a single visible flinch. The sheer toxicity of their words echoed off the vaulted ceilings. They gorged themselves on expensive, catered food, mocking a hardworking father and an innocent 10-year-old boy. They felt incredibly powerful, entirely invincible in their temporary debt-fueled castle. They thought they were looking down on a helpless, destitute maid. They had absolutely no idea they were actively insulting the sole heir to a vast corporate empire and speaking directly to the woman holding their entire financial survival in the palm of her hand. I stood quietly in the dining room corner, playing the submissive servant to absolute perfection. I cleared their dirty salad plates, scraping their discarded food into the trash. With every cruel joke they made about Ian's supposed poverty, my resolve hardened into solid ice. I watched Jamal raise his glass one final time, proposing a grand, arrogant toast to Vanguard Horizon and the imminent, glorious rescue of their real estate empire. I smiled softly, stepping backward into the shadows of the kitchen. I untied the white apron, letting it fall onto the cold marble counter. Jamal's desperate investment application was sitting on my secure tablet back at the heavily guarded downtown penthouse. They had gorged themselves on false hope tonight. They believed a corporate savior was coming to validate their greed and wipe away their massive failures. I watched them toast to their brilliant future, knowing exactly how I was going to turn their Thanksgiving arrogance into an absolute nightmare of financial devastation and utter ruin. The clinking of crystal glasses and booming laughter continued to echo from the formal dining room as I stood alone in the pristine kitchen. I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly adjusting my posture to return to my role as the pathetic, defeated sister. I picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with intricate dessert pastries and walked meekly back into the lion's den. Jamal was still holding court at the head of the table, his silk tie loosened, boasting about how his flawless investment proposal was currently sitting in the Vanguard Horizon digital queue. He arrogantly assured my father that it was only a matter of days before the elusive billionaire chief executive personally reviewed his genius financial models. I approached his chair, lowering my head and keeping my voice trembling just enough to sound genuinely intimidated. I quietly cleared my throat, apologizing for interrupting his grand speech. Jamal stopped mid-sentence, glaring at me with absolute disdain, clearly annoyed that the hired help was daring to speak. I nervously wiped my hands on my white apron. I told him I could not help but overhear his conversation about Vanguard Horizon. I stammered, twisting my fingers together, playing the absolute fool. I mentioned that Ian, my supposedly broke husband, had a close friend who worked the night shift as a janitor, cleaning the top executive floors of that exact corporate headquarters. The entire dining room went dead silent. Cynthia rolled her eyes, scoffing loudly at the mere mention of my husband associating with manual laborers. Brittany let out a sharp, mocking laugh, asking why on earth a high-powered investment banker would ever need the services of a toilet scrubber. Jamal held up his hand, silencing his wife. His arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. I saw the desperate, panicked wheels turning rapidly behind his dark eyes. He knew his digital application was hopelessly buried among thousands of other desperate corporate pleas. He knew he only had a few weeks before his own bank auditors threw him into federal prison. The sheer thought of bypassing the entire corporate gatekeeping system and placing his physical portfolio directly onto the billionaire's private mahogany desk was an intoxicating, irresistible lifeline. Jamal leaned forward, resting his heavy elbows on the dining table. He looked at me as if examining a particularly useful insect. He demanded to know if this janitor had unrestricted security access to the primary executive suite. I nodded frantically, staring at my worn shoes. I whispered that Ian's friend cleaned the main office every single night at midnight, entirely unsupervised. I suggested that if Jamal printed a physical hard copy of his investment pitch, Ian could ask his friend to leave it right in the center of the chief executive's desk. Jamal let out a booming, theatrical laugh, slapping the table hard. He looked at Thomas, his eyes gleaming with greedy desperation, masked as brilliant opportunism. Jamal declared it was a hilarious but highly strategic maneuver. He reasoned that a billionaire would be deeply intrigued by a bold, unconventional delivery method. He turned back to me, ordering me to have Ian contact this janitor immediately. He promised to hand me a sealed leather binder first thing Monday morning. I nodded submissively, backing away into the kitchen, my heart pounding with pure, exhilarating victory. The arrogant fool had swallowed the poisoned bait whole. Over the next 48 hours, Jamal's desperate need to secure the Vanguard Horizon bailout drove him to execute a series of catastrophically reckless financial maneuvers. He knew the secretive venture capital firm would run a brutal, microscopic audit of his submitted portfolio. His current balance sheets were violently bleeding cash, severely weighed down by the stalled commercial construction project. To make his financial profile look incredibly lucrative and highly liquid for the billionaire's impending review, Jamal needed a massive, immediate injection of raw cash. Operating in pure panic mode, Jamal convinced my father to double down on their toxic gamble. They secretly approached an underground syndicate of predatory high-interest private lenders. To secure the rapid bridge loans, Jamal and Thomas recklessly put up absolutely every single asset the family legally owned as direct collateral. They remortgaged their sprawling suburban mansions. They liquidated my mother's remaining stock portfolios. And most sickeningly, they signed away the absolute legal deed to my late grandmother's cozy house, the very home they had so cruelly evicted me from just months prior. They leveraged their entire existence to the absolute breaking point, artificially inflating their bank accounts to make the Vanguard Horizon application look flawlessly profitable. They pushed all their chips into the center of the table, entirely convinced that the billionaire would be dazzled by their fake liquidity and save them. Late Monday evening, I sat at the massive marble dining table inside our highly secure downtown penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the glowing city skyline. Ian sat quietly on the plush velvet sofa, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon, watching me work. Resting directly in front of me on the cold marble was a thick, premium leather binder. Jamal had practically shoved it into my hands that morning, ordering me to guard it with my life and ensure the janitor delivered it safely. I opened the leather cover, slowly turning the crisp, high-quality pages of his desperate proposal. The financial models were completely fabricated, padded with the predatory loan money he had just secured by risking my grandmother's home. It was a masterpiece of corporate fraud and arrogant desperation. Jamal had literally bet his freedom, his family's entire wealth, and his professional legacy on this single document. He thought he was outsmarting the system. I thought he was using my pathetic poverty to gain a massive corporate advantage. I reached across the marble table and picked up my crystal glass of vintage red wine. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip, letting the rich flavor wash over my tongue. I set the glass down and picked up a thick, bold red marker. I stared at the highly arrogant cover letter Jamal had written to the anonymous chief executive officer. I pressed the marker firmly against the pristine white paper. With one swift, aggressive motion, I drew a massive, jagged red X directly across his fraudulent, desperate plea. The trap had successfully closed around their throats, and they had absolutely no idea the executioner was already in the room. The red marker squeaked against the thick paper, leaving a jagged, bleeding cross over Jamal's arrogant signature. I stared down at the ruined proposal, feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of absolute control. Ian sat quietly on the velvet sofa, nursing his bourbon. He did not ask what I was doing. He simply watched the fierce determination settle over my features. The time for hiding in the shadows was officially over. It was time to pull the trigger and watch their empire burn to ashes. I walked over to the secure Vanguard Horizon terminal, glowing on the executive desk. I initiated the formal review protocol. I did not just hit a generic decline button. I meticulously drafted a brutally comprehensive rejection letter from the Office of the Chief Executive Officer. I systematically dismantled every single fraudulent financial model Jamal had presented. I highlighted the dangerously toxic debt he had attempted to hide and exposed the predatory bridge loans he had desperately secured using my late grandmother's house as collateral. I made absolutely certain that this rejection was not just a simple corporate denial. It was a highly detailed, undeniable exposure of severe financial negligence and potential federal fraud. I addressed the devastating document directly to Jamal, but I did not stop there. Using the firm's unlimited administrative access, I copied the rejection letter to the senior audit board of Jamal's investment bank. I hit the send button just as the sun began to rise over the sprawling city skyline. The digital hammer dropped with absolute deafening finality. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. By 9 o'clock that morning, the internal auditors at Jamal's banking institution opened their encrypted inboxes. They read the scathing assessment from the most powerful venture capital firm on the planet. The reaction was swift and merciless. Security personnel marched directly into Jamal's lavish corner office. They stripped him of his corporate credentials, confiscated his company devices, and physically escorted him out of the glass building before he could even finish his morning coffee. His termination was just the first domino to fall. The financial shockwave traveled rapidly through the highly connected banking district. The predatory underground lenders, who had blindly financed my father's doomed commercial real estate venture, caught wind of the catastrophic Vanguard Horizon rejection. Panic spread like a vicious wildfire among the aggressive creditors. They realized the massive shopping district was a complete illusion built on worthless fabricated numbers. Before lunchtime, the ruthless lenders triggered an immediate non-negotiable margin call. They demanded total repayment of the staggering multi-million-dollar bridge loans within 48 hours. The sudden demand for liquid cash hit my arrogant family like a devastating physical blow. Thomas was standing proudly on the muddy construction site of his stalled vanity project when his phone began to ring incessantly. He answered the call, fully expecting to hear Jamal boasting about a successful billionaire bailout. Instead, he heard the aggressive, threatening voices of ruthless creditors, informing him that his entire financial existence was about to be forcibly seized. His face drained of all color as the massive yellow bulldozers he had hired to demolish my grandmother's house were suddenly repossessed by leasing agencies right in front of his eyes. Chaos erupted within the walls of Jamal and Brittany's flashy new suburban mansion. Jamal paced the hardwood floors like a trapped, desperate animal, screaming wildly into his cell phone as former colleagues refused to take his calls. Brittany watched in mounting horror as her premium platinum credit cards were violently declined one after another. She attempted to purchase a luxury handbag online to soothe her anxiety, only to be met with glaring red error screens. The sprawling estate they had so proudly paraded around just days prior was rapidly transforming into a suffocating, incredibly expensive prison. Cynthia's carefully constructed world of elite country clubs and designer wardrobes violently collapsed. The bank froze all of her joint checking accounts without warning. When she attempted to pay her country club membership dues, the transaction was flagged and publicly denied in front of her wealthy peers. The brutal humiliation she had inflicted upon me for years was finally returning to suffocate her. She frantically dialed Thomas, her voice shrill with absolute panic, demanding to know why their limitless wealth had suddenly evaporated into thin air. By the end of the week, the sheer magnitude of their ruin was undeniable. The massive commercial real estate project was officially declared bankrupt. Heavy steel chains and glaring foreclosure notices were locked across the gates of their construction sites. The creditors moved with aggressive speed to secure their collateral. Legal notices were violently taped to the front doors of my parents' sprawling estate and Jamal's new mansion. The threat of total asset seizure loomed over their heads like a swinging pendulum. They were drowning in a toxic sea of aggressive debt, entirely isolated from the wealthy social circles they had fought so viciously to infiltrate. The arrogant patriarch who had mocked my supposed poverty was now desperately begging former business partners for minor personal loans. The golden child sister who had dumped filthy clothes on my desk was now frantically trying to pawn her designer jewelry just to keep the electricity running in her massive, echoing house. They had risked absolutely everything on a fraudulent gamble, convinced that their sheer arrogance would protect them from failure. I watched their systematic destruction from the safety of the secure penthouse. Ian stood beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, as we monitored the rapid collapse of their toxic empire through highly classified financial feeds. The sheer poetic justice of their ruin brought me a profound, exhilarating sense of peace. They had tried to throw an innocent 10-year-old boy onto the freezing streets. Now they stared directly into the terrifying abyss of absolute homelessness. But their desperation was far from over. I knew a family built on such intense greed would never quietly accept defeat. They needed fresh victims. The frantic, desperate search for a new victim brought my family exactly where I wanted them. I knew the moment Vanguard Horizon rejected their proposal and their creditors initiated the margin calls, they would inevitably come looking for me. They needed a scapegoat to absorb the catastrophic fallout of their greed. Anticipating their arrival, I used cash to rent a squalid, roach-infested studio apartment on the absolute worst side of the city. The crumbling building smelled of damp mold and cheap ammonia. The wallpaper was peeling in thick yellow strips and the single window looked out over a trash-filled alleyway. It was the perfect, pathetic stage for their final act of betrayal. I sat on a stained second-hand mattress, pushed into the corner of the tiny room, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt and worn-out jeans. I listened intently as heavy, hurried footsteps echoed down the narrow, dimly lit hallway outside. A frantic, aggressive pounding rattled the flimsy wooden door. I stood up, taking a deep breath to steady my expression, and turned the rusted deadbolt. My parents, my sister Brittany, and my brother-in-law Jamal stumbled into the cramped apartment. The sheer contrast between their current appearance and their usual arrogant glamour was staggering. Thomas wore a wrinkled suit jacket, his face pale and covered in a nervous sweat. Cynthia looked completely unhinged. Her expensive makeup was smeared under her eyes, and her hands shook violently as she clutched her designer purse like a life preserver. Brittany had clearly been crying, her eyes bloodshot and swollen. Jamal looked like a cornered animal. His breathing was heavy and the confident, commanding aura he usually projected as a powerful credit director had completely evaporated. They stared around the filthy, cramped apartment with absolute horror, but their desperation quickly overrode their disgust. Cynthia rushed forward and collapsed onto the cheap linoleum floor right in front of me. She burst into violent, hysterical tears. My mother, the woman who had coldly told me to go live in the slums and mocked my husband's rusted car, was now physically sobbing at my feet. She grabbed my hands, her fingers digging painfully into my skin, and began wailing about a sudden, catastrophic family emergency. She claimed a massive misunderstanding with their commercial real estate lenders had temporarily frozen all their assets. Thomas chimed in, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He told me they were facing imminent foreclosure, total asset seizure, and complete public humiliation. He desperately explained that the family empire was collapsing and they needed my immediate help to survive the crisis. I stood there looking down at my weeping parents, keeping my expression perfectly arranged in a mask of shocked, sympathetic concern. I asked them how a broke, unemployed teacher living in a rundown apartment could possibly help them. Jamal stepped forward, shoving his hands into his pockets to hide their violent trembling. He cleared his throat, attempting to summon a fraction of his former authority. He told me they had found a highly strategic solution to save the entire family. He explained that a very senior, incredibly wealthy managing partner at his former investment bank had recently lost his wife. According to Jamal, this elderly multimillionaire had always expressed a disturbing, inappropriate interest in me during past corporate holiday parties. Jamal looked me dead in the eyes and delivered his sickening proposal. He demanded that I divorce Ian immediately. He wanted me to completely abandon my husband and his 10-year-old son and legally marry this elderly banking executive. Jamal calculated that the man's massive fortune and corporate influence could instantly shield our family from the aggressive creditors and silence the internal auditors calling for his arrest. They were literally demanding that I sell my body and my marriage to an old man to buy their way out of financial ruin. I stared at Jamal in profound, sickening disbelief. I asked him if he was seriously demanding I prostitute myself to save his bank accounts. Cynthia scrambled to her feet, wiping her ruined makeup. She aggressively insisted it was a necessary family sacrifice. She told me Ian was a broke loser who could not provide for me anyway, and that marrying this wealthy executive was my ultimate duty as a daughter. When I flatly refused, shaking my head in absolute disgust, Brittany stepped forward. Her voice was shrill and vibrating with venom. "If you will not divorce that pathetic mechanic, then he needs to make himself useful," Brittany snapped. Jamal reached into his wrinkled leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of dense legal documents. He slapped the heavy paperwork down onto the stained kitchen counter. Jamal explained his secondary backup plan. The internal banking auditors were finalizing their investigation into the fraudulent toxic loans he had approved. He needed a fall guy, a proxy, to absorb the catastrophic criminal charges. He pointed to the documents and demanded that I manipulate Ian into signing them. The papers were meticulously forged to legally indicate that Ian had been the primary external consultant who falsified the commercial real estate data. Jamal reasoned that since Ian was already a poverty-stricken failure, living in a slum going to federal prison would not ruin any meaningful reputation. Jamal, however, was far too important, too elite, and too brilliant to spend a single day behind bars. They wanted to send an innocent, hardworking father to a federal penitentiary for corporate fraud, just so Jamal could avoid taking responsibility for his own malicious greed. The sheer, unadulterated evil of their demands echoed in the small, roach-infested room. They were entirely willing to destroy my life, sell me to a wealthy stranger, or lock my innocent husband in a cage, all to maintain their toxic, superficial wealth. I stood silently by the counter, placing my hand flat over the stack of fraudulent legal documents. I looked at the four desperate, pathetic people standing in my fake apartment. They thought they were cornering a weak, helpless victim. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one who had meticulously orchestrated their entire financial collapse, or that the husband they were trying to frame for fraud was the very billionaire holding the chains around their throats. I stared down at the stack of forged documents resting on the stained kitchen counter. The sheer audacity of their demands hung heavily in the stale air of the rotting apartment. Jamal shifted his weight, crossing his arms, and fully expecting me to eagerly grab a cheap plastic pen to sign my innocent husband's life away. Cynthia impatiently tapped her expensive designer heel against the peeling linoleum, waiting for me to bow completely to her supreme command. I slowly pulled my hand back from the heavy paperwork. I looked directly into Jamal's panicked, bloodshot eyes and delivered a single razor-sharp word: no. The single syllable echoed through the tiny room like a deafening gunshot. Brittany gasped loudly, her jaw dropping in profound theatrical outrage. Jamal stepped forward, his fists clenching aggressively at his sides. He demanded to know what I meant, his voice rising in an aggressive, desperate pitch of disbelief. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my tone dropping to an ice-cold, unwavering register. I told him I would absolutely not divorce the man I loved to become a purchased bride for some ancient, corrupt banking executive. And I would certainly not allow my hardworking husband to take the fall for a massive, catastrophic financial fraud that Jamal alone had maliciously orchestrated. Thomas slammed his heavy hand down on the counter, rattling the cheap plastic cabinetry. He screamed that I was being an ungrateful, selfish brat. He wildly claimed this was my one and only chance to finally repay the family for carrying my dead weight all these years. The sheer blinding delusion snapped the final thread of my restraint. I stepped away from the counter, squaring my shoulders, and I systematically tore down the sickening illusion they called a family. I reminded Thomas that my entire life had been nothing but a continuous series of emotional punishments and cruel comparisons. I turned my piercing gaze to Cynthia and explicitly brought up the filthy, moth-eaten clothes she had proudly dumped on my desk just to humiliate an innocent 10-year-old boy. I pointed straight at Brittany, recalling the gleeful, vicious smirk on her face when they handed me an eviction notice just 3 days after my wedding. I laid out their sickening greed with absolute surgical precision. I told them they were not asking for a simple family favor. They were demanding a human sacrifice to cover up their own malicious incompetence. I declared that their massive debts, their impending bankruptcies, and Jamal's looming federal prison sentence were the direct, inescapable consequences of their own unyielding arrogance. The brutal truth hit them like a physical assault. My mother's face contorted into a dark mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her fake, manipulative tears vanished, instantly replaced by a vicious snarl. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. Cynthia screamed that I was an absolute disgrace, a worthless mistake she should have discarded decades ago. Thomas stepped up beside her, his face purple with blinding rage. He cursed my name, his heavy voice echoing off the thin walls of the slum apartment. He swore that if their financial empire fell, he would personally make sure I suffered in extreme poverty for the rest of my miserable existence. With spit flying from his lips, my father officially declared that I was completely dead to them. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear for the loss of my biological parents. I simply walked over to the flimsy front door and pulled it wide open. I told them to get out of my home and never contact me again. Jamal snatched the forged legal documents from the counter, his hands shaking with a terrifying mix of fury and utter despair. He grabbed a hysterical Brittany by the arm and dragged her out into the dim hallway. Thomas and Cynthia followed closely behind, hurling final, venomous curses as they fled the rotting building. I slammed the door shut and locked the deadbolt, feeling an overwhelming, intoxicating wave of liberation wash over my entire soul. While I quietly returned to the secure, bulletproof luxury of the downtown penthouse, Jamal was rapidly spiraling into absolute unchecked panic. The clock was violently ticking down to his imminent arrest. The internal bank auditors were closing in, and my firm refusal to provide a convenient scapegoat left him entirely exposed to federal prosecution. Desperation drove him to execute a final, highly reckless maneuver. He knew Vanguard Horizon was his only remaining lifeline. If he could just get 10 minutes face-to-face with the venture capital firm's secretive chief executive officer, Jamal arrogantly believed he could charm his way into a massive bailout and negotiate total legal immunity. Through his crumbling network of desperate financial brokers, Jamal intercepted a highly classified rumor. The elusive billionaire founder of Vanguard Horizon was scheduled to make a rare, unannounced appearance at an upcoming ultra-exclusive charity gala hosted by the city's absolute highest elite. It was a tightly closed-door event, strictly invite-only, and heavily guarded by private security contractors. Jamal did not have an invitation. His social standing had already been heavily decimated by the aggressive margin calls and looming bankruptcy rumors swirling around the financial district. Operating in pure, unadulterated survival mode, Jamal drained the very last drops of a secret offshore emergency fund he had illegally hidden from my father and the banking auditors. He funneled every remaining dollar into the dark web to purchase heavily marked-up black market tickets from a desperate, bankrupt socialite. It was a massive, terrifying gamble. He was betting his entire freedom on a single night. Jamal meticulously planned to crash the high society gala, aggressively bypass the intense security protocols, and physically ambush the Vanguard CEO. He fully intended to drop to his knees in front of the billionaire and beg for his corporate life. He thought he was orchestrating the ultimate brilliant comeback. He fully believed his aggressive networking skills and relentless charm would secure the miraculous investment and magically restore his toxic empire. Jamal had absolutely no idea that the highly anticipated charity gala was the exact location I had meticulously selected for the final devastating blow. I was draining his very last pennies to buy front-row seats to his own magnificent execution. The trap was perfectly primed, and the spectacular main event was about to begin. The highly anticipated evening of the annual charity gala finally arrived, casting a brilliant golden glow over the city's most exclusive and heavily guarded grand ballroom. I stood quietly in the shadowed elevated VIP balcony overlooking the massive expanse of the main floor. I wore a luxurious silk robe while a team of elite stylists meticulously perfected my hair and makeup for the grand reveal. I held a crystal glass of sparkling water, staring down at the sprawling sea of true billionaires. corporate titans and international socialites gathering below. The immense venue was decorated with cascading crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements of rare white orchids and immaculate ice sculptures. It was a flawless, dazzling display of absolute untouchable wealth. But my focus was not on the breathtaking decor. My eyes were firmly fixed on the grand entrance doors, waiting patiently for the arrival of my desperate, completely ruined family. Right on cue, the heavy brass doors swung open, and the pathetic spectacle I had anticipated perfectly unfolded. Thomas, Cynthia, Brittany, and Jamal did not arrive in a sleek chauffeured limousine like the rest of the esteemed guests. They tumbled out of a standard dusty ride-share vehicle, looking incredibly frantic and entirely out of place. As they stepped onto the plush crimson carpet, the sheer undeniable desperation radiating from their bodies was instantly suffocating. They were trying to project an aura of effortless elite status, but they failed spectacularly. I watched from above as they handed their extremely expensive black market tickets to the stern reception staff. Their hands visibly shook with crippling anxiety. Their physical appearance was a glaring, tragic testament to their catastrophic financial collapse. They had clearly spent their final remaining dollars renting formal wear that did not fit them properly. Cynthia, a woman who once arrogantly flaunted her custom designer wardrobe to humiliate me, was wearing a faded, deeply outdated sequined gown. The fabric bunched awkwardly around her waist, and the cheap material completely lacked the elegant flow of the authentic haute couture worn by the women surrounding her. Thomas tugged uncomfortably at the stiff collar of his rented tuxedo. The jacket was far too tight across his broad shoulders, making him look stiff and heavily restricted. Brittany wobbled precariously on scuffed discount heels, her rented dress clinging too tightly to her frame. She constantly adjusted her neckline, desperately trying to project an air of sophisticated wealth, but she only looked incredibly frantic and deeply insecure. Jamal was the most pathetic sight of all. The once arrogant, domineering credit director who had cruelly tossed a $50 bill at my wedding table was currently sweating profusely through a cheap, poorly tailored suit. The jacket sleeves were slightly too short, and the fabric wrinkled horribly around his elbows. He completely ignored the breathtaking ambiance of the grand ballroom. His bloodshot eyes darted wildly around the crowded room, operating in pure, unadulterated survival mode. I was not here to enjoy the champagne or admire the ice sculptures. He was a cornered, desperate animal aggressively hunting for the elusive chief executive officer of Vanguard Horizon, fully believing that a single miraculous conversation could magically erase his impending federal prison sentence. I watched with profound, chilling satisfaction as they nervously waded into the glittering crowd. They instantly deployed their usual aggressive networking tactics, completely unaware that their toxic reputation had already begun to quietly circulate among the city's highest elite. Cynthia spotted a prominent socialite she recognized from a luxury lifestyle magazine. She plastered a fake wide smile across her face and marched over, attempting to insert herself into the exclusive conversation. The socialite took one brief, highly judgmental look at Cynthia's rented dress, offered a tight, completely frozen smile, and immediately turned her back, leaving my mother standing alone and deeply humiliated. Thomas tried to aggressively corner a group of wealthy commercial real estate tycoons near the main bar. He puffed out his chest, attempting to boast about his stalled construction projects, hoping to project an image of a thriving developer. The wealthy men simply stared at him with blank, unyielding expressions, politely excusing themselves before Thomas could even finish his desperate pitch. Brittany hovered near the catering staff, aggressively snatching glasses of premium champagne to soothe her mounting terror. She tried to make eye contact with the wealthy heirs and young executives circulating the room, but her frantic, wide-eyed desperation acted like a powerful repellent. They were entirely isolated in a massive sea of wealth, completely invisible to the people they so desperately wanted to impress. Meanwhile, Jamal separated himself from the group, aggressively pushing his way through the dense crowd, his panicked gaze locked onto the heavy velvet ropes and armed security personnel guarding the grand staircase that led to the elevated VIP lounge. His arrogant, deeply flawed logic immediately concluded that the secretive billionaire he was hunting must be relaxing in the restricted ultra-exclusive area. Jamal straightened his cheap tie, attempting to summon the dominating, commanding aura he used to wield at his investment bank. He marched directly toward the velvet ropes, with a terrifying, blinding sense of absolute entitlement. He did not politely ask for entry. He attempted to aggressively shove past the two massive, highly trained security contractors guarding the staircase. The guards instantly stepped forward, forming an impenetrable human wall of solid muscle. They firmly placed their heavy hands against Jamal's chest, physically blocking his path and demanding to see his elite credentials. Jamal's fragile composure violently snapped. He began shouting, his voice echoing shrilly over the soft classical music playing in the ballroom. He aggressively pointed his finger in the head security guard's face, loudly demanding immediate entry. He arrogantly claimed he was a powerful banking executive who had a private, highly classified meeting scheduled directly with the founder of Vanguard Horizon. The head of security did not flinch. He looked at Jamal's sweating face and cheap, ill-fitting suit with absolute freezing contempt. When Jamal recklessly attempted to physically shove the guard's arm away, the response was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. The massive guard grabbed Jamal firmly by the lapels of his rented jacket. With one powerful, effortless motion, he violently shoved Jamal backward. Jamal lost his footing on the polished marble floor. His arms flailed wildly in the air as he stumbled backward, completely losing his balance. He crashed hard onto the cold floor, landing directly on his back with a loud, sickening thud. The loud commotion drew the immediate, horrified attention of the surrounding elite guests. Dozens of true billionaires and influential corporate leaders turned to watch the pathetic spectacle. A sharp chorus of shocked gasps and mocking whispers rippled through the wealthy crowd. Thomas, Cynthia, and Brittany froze in absolute horror, watching their supposed savior sprawled pathetically on the floor, deeply humiliated in front of the exact people they worshipped. From my shadowed vantage point in the high VIP balcony, I looked down at Jamal groveling on the cold marble. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my sparkling water. The first brutal strike had landed flawlessly, and the true devastating execution was only moments away. I handed my empty crystal glass to an attendant waiting silently in the shadows of the elevated balcony. The time for observation had officially expired. It was time to step into the blinding light. A renowned stylist stepped forward, making one final meticulous adjustment to the bodice of my gown. The dress was an absolute masterpiece of haute couture, a striking silhouette of midnight blue silk, moving gracefully like liquid shadow. It hugged my waist perfectly before cascading down into a dramatic sweeping train. The true centerpiece of my armor rested heavily against my collarbone. It was a breathtaking multi-million-dollar diamond necklace loaned directly from a private royal vault at Ian's personal request. The brilliant cut stones caught every single fraction of ambient light, casting brilliant fractured rainbows across the dark walls of the VIP corridor. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the intoxicating weight of the immense wealth I was about to wield. I walked down the plush, private staircase, my expensive heels making absolutely no sound on the thick carpet. At the bottom, standing perfectly still in front of the towering, gilded double doors that led into the main ballroom, was my husband. I stopped breathing for a second. Ian had completely shed every single trace of the struggling single father. The faded denim and rusted aesthetics were entirely gone. He stood there wearing a bespoke, razor-sharp black tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders with lethal, terrifying perfection. The fine Italian wool and crisp white shirt emphasized the raw, commanding authority he usually kept carefully hidden from the world. His dark eyes locked intensely onto mine as I approached. He did not look like a man preparing to attend a simple charity event. He looked like an apex predator fully prepared to conquer an entire empire. He extended his arm toward me, a slow, incredibly dangerous smile curving his lips. He told me I looked absolutely devastating. I slipped my hand through the crook of his elbow, feeling the solid, unyielding muscle beneath the expensive fabric. I whispered back that we were about to become their ultimate nightmare. We stood together in the quiet staging area, a perfectly unified front of absolute undeniable power, waiting for our cue. Beyond the heavy brass doors, the chaotic hum of the grand ballroom suddenly began to quiet down. The prestigious host of the evening had stepped up to the crystal podium, gently tapping the microphone to command the immediate attention of the city's highest elite. The sharp feedback echoed through the massive venue, instantly silencing the classical string quartet. Down on the marble floor, the atmosphere shifted rapidly into palpable electric anticipation. I could easily picture the pathetic scene currently unfolding near the front of the stage. Jamal had scrambled up from the cold floor, frantically brushing the invisible dirt from his cheap, heavily wrinkled suit jacket. He was desperately shoving his way through the crowd of genuine billionaires, dragging my trembling parents and a hyperventilating Brittany right up to the velvet boundary ropes. They were positioning them as corporate savior the exact second he appeared. Jamal was likely rehearsing his groveling, pathetic elevator pitch, entirely convinced that his aggressive charm would secure the miraculous Vanguard Horizon bailout. They thought they were about to meet a faceless, sympathetic banking titan who would effortlessly wipe away their catastrophic debts and save them from impending federal prison sentences. The host's booming voice filled the silent, glittering ballroom. He spoke eloquently about the incredible philanthropic efforts of the evening, praising the massive financial contributions that made the charity gala a historic success. Then his tone shifted, dropping into a register of profound, ultimate respect. He announced that it was his supreme distinct honor to introduce the most elusive, powerful, and aggressively successful venture capitalist in the entire modern financial sector. He spoke of a man whose brilliant, ruthless corporate strategies had reshaped the global economy, a man who rarely made public appearances, but whose immense charitable donations had quietly sustained the city's most vital infrastructures. The host raised his hand, gesturing dramatically toward the back of the venue. He proudly requested a warm, prestigious welcome for the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Horizon. The applause began immediately, a thunderous rolling wave of respect from the most powerful corporate leaders in the room. The massive overhead spotlights swung violently away from the main stage, slicing through the dim ballroom to focus entirely on the towering gilded double doors. Ian looked down at me one last time, his dark eyes burning with absolute unwavering resolve. I tightened my grip on his arm, tilting my chin up to project total freezing dominance. The brass doors swung wide open. We stepped forward simultaneously, walking directly into the blinding, brilliant circles of pure white light. The instant we crossed the threshold, the deafening applause began to falter. A strange physical shockwave rippled through the massive crowd. The genuine billionaires and elite socialites recognized Ian, immediately bowing their heads in profound, silent respect as he strode onto the crimson carpet. He radiated an aura of absolute terrifying power and incalculable wealth. His posture was rigid, commanding the entire room with a single sweeping glance. And holding his arm, walking with slow, predatory grace, was the woman my family had mercilessly thrown onto the freezing street. The multi-million-dollar diamonds around my neck flared violently under the intense spotlights, blinding anyone who dared to stare too long. My midnight blue gown swept across the marble floor like a dark, elegant storm. We did not rush. We walked with the slow, deliberate pace of conquering royalty, demanding absolute silence from the stunned, glittering crowd. We advanced directly toward the center of the grand ballroom, moving straight toward the velvet boundary ropes, where my toxic, ruined family was desperately waiting. The trap had officially sprung wide open, and the execution was completely inevitable. The heavy silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor. We stopped just a few feet away from the thick velvet ropes, standing directly in the center of the blinding spotlight. The elite crowd parted around us, forming a wide, respectful circle. Across the small divide, my family stood frozen, entirely trapped in the agonizing seconds between confusion and profound recognition. They had pushed their way to the very front, their eyes wide with desperate anticipation, fully expecting to greet a stranger who would magically erase their massive debts. Instead, they were staring directly into the faces of the two people they had ruthlessly discarded. I watched the cognitive dissonance violently tear through my mother first. Cynthia stood rigid, her manicured fingers tightly gripping a delicate crystal flute of premium champagne. Her eyes darted from the pristine tailoring of Ian's bespoke tuxedo to the commanding predatory angle of his jaw, trying desperately to reconcile this towering titan of industry with the quiet man who used to wash dishes in my grandmother's tiny kitchen. The reality crashed into her brain with terrifying force. Her jaw fell open, emitting a soft, breathless gasp that barely carried over the ambient hum of the venue. Her hands lost all motor function. The expensive crystal glass slipped smoothly from her trembling fingers. It plummeted toward the floor, shattering violently against the hard marble. The sharp, explosive crack of the breaking glass echoed sharply, splashing pale liquid over the hem of her rented, ill-fitting gown. She did not even blink. She just stared at the multi-million-dollar diamond necklace resting heavily against my collarbone, her entire worldview completely disintegrating before her eyes. Beside her, Thomas looked as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the massive room. His broad shoulders, usually thrown back in a posture of aggressive suburban dominance, suddenly caved inward. The arrogant patriarch who had proudly orchestrated my cruel eviction was now visibly shrinking. I could practically see the frantic calculations misfiring in his mind. He was looking at the very man he had relentlessly mocked, the man he had called a pathetic, broke loser who was entirely unworthy of his precious family name. Now he realized that this supposed loser was the supreme, untouchable architect of his total financial ruin. Thomas clutched the lapels of his tight-rented tuxedo jacket, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The enormous multi-million-dollar commercial real estate empire he had gambled his life on was now officially dust, and the executioner holding the match was his own son-in-law. Brittany's reaction was a spectacular display of unadulterated raw terror. As the golden child, she had spent her entire existence thriving on the absolute certainty that she was vastly superior to me in every conceivable metric. She took one long, agonizing look at my midnight blue silk gown, recognizing the flawless, authentic haute couture that she could never afford even on her best day. The sheer blinding brilliance of the royal diamonds around my neck physically repelled her. Her heavily made-up face contorted into a mask of pure visceral horror. The fierce jealousy that usually fueled her toxic ego was instantly overwhelmed by a crashing wave of suffocating panic. She realized that the sister she had forced to serve appetizers like a lowly maid at Thanksgiving was currently standing at the absolute pinnacle of high society. Brittany began to hyperventilate. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, jerky spasms. She clawed frantically at the high neckline of her cheap, restrictive dress, desperately gasping for air that her lungs simply refused to process. She stumbled backward, bumping heavily into a passing waiter, completely losing whatever fragile composure she had desperately tried to fake. But the most magnificent, profoundly satisfying breakdown belonged entirely to Jamal. The towering, aggressively arrogant credit director had staked his freedom, his career, and his entire identity on this single desperate ambush. He had drained his last secret offshore accounts just to buy a ticket to beg for his corporate life. Now he was staring directly into the dark, merciless eyes of his executioner. Jamal turned a sickening shade of ash gray. The rich, confident complexion he usually projected vanished, replaced by the pallor of a man walking directly to the gallows. A violent, uncontrollable tremor seized his entire body. The heavy gold-plated watch on his wrist rattled audibly as his hands shook with crippling terror. The terrifying truth hit him with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. The elusive almighty billionaire he had planned to ambush, the corporate savior he had planned to drop to his knees and beg for a miraculous bailout, was the exact same man whose rusted car he had loudly mocked at my wedding reception. The man he had cruelly joked was scrubbing toilets to afford a cheap turkey was the supreme sovereign of the global financial sector. Worse still, Jamal's panic-stricken eyes slowly shifted from Ian's imposing figure to my face. The absolute freezing realization settled into his bones. The woman holding the master keys to his entire survival. The woman who had personally reviewed and rejected his fraudulent toxic loan applications was the sister-in-law he had aggressively tried to enslave as an unpaid nanny. I stood there radiating absolute unapologetic power, looking down at him with the exact same freezing contempt he had shown me when he handed me that eviction notice. Jamal's knees literally buckled under the immense crushing weight of his catastrophic failure. He swayed dangerously on his feet, his polished shoes slipping slightly on the slick marble floor. He had to reach out and grab the thick velvet boundary rope just to keep himself from collapsing completely into a pathetic heap. His monumental arrogance had finally shattered. He had mercilessly bullied the only two people possessing the absolute power to save his entire existence from federal prison. Jamal's agonizing paralysis suddenly snapped. Pure animalistic panic completely overrode whatever shreds of dignity remained. He released the velvet rope and lunged. He shoved past stunned coordinator's shoes, slipping wildly on polished marble. He sprinted directly into the spotlight toward us, arms outstretched in a pathetic display of surrender. The elite crowd gasped instinctively, pulling back as the sweating man barreled through their pristine circle. Brother-in-law Jamal screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail that echoed across the grand ballroom. "Please, Ian, please wait!" He threw himself forward, his knees slamming brutally against the marble floor right at our feet. He reached out with trembling hands and desperately grabbed the hem of Ian's bespoke tuxedo jacket. Jamal looked up, tears of terror streaming down his ash-gray face. The arrogant credit director who ruthlessly mocked my husband's rusted car was now groveling, begging for his corporate life in front of the most powerful financial titans on the planet. Ian did not even blink. He looked down at the sobbing man clutching his coat with an expression of cold apathy. Before Ian could signal approaching security, I stepped smoothly forward. I moved with deliberate grace, positioning my body directly between my husband and the pathetic creature weeping at his feet. I looked down at Jamal, letting every ounce of the disgust I felt radiate from my posture. "Do not ever touch my husband again," I commanded. My voice was low, but it carried an authority that made Jamal physically recoil. He released the fabric, instantly scrambling backward on his hands and knees like a disciplined dog. I turned my gaze away, looking out at the vast sea of shocked billionaires and influential socialites. I walked calmly toward the crystal podium where the host stood frozen in profound disbelief. The host wisely stepped aside, offering me the microphone without a word of protest. I grasped the smooth metal stem. I did not rush. I took a slow breath, allowing the suffocating silence of the massive ballroom to stretch out, ensuring every single person in the room was hanging on my next move. "Good evening," I began, my voice projecting clearly through the high-end acoustic system. "My husband Ian and I would like to sincerely thank you all for attending this magnificent charity gala. Vanguard Horizon is committed to fostering integrity, transparency, and philanthropy within this city. However, true integrity requires aggressively shining a light on the darkest, most malignant corners of our community." I looked directly at the velvet boundary ropes. Cynthia was hyperventilating, leaning heavily against Thomas, who looked like he was about to suffer a massive coronary event. Brittany was openly weeping, desperately trying to hide her face behind her hands. The people you see desperately trying to blend into this esteemed crowd tonight are my biological parents, Thomas and Cynthia, my sister Brittany, and the man currently crying on the floor, Jamal. I spoke with a calm, surgical precision that cut through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. Many of you in the commercial real estate and investment banking sectors likely recognize them. They have spent the entire evening desperately attempting to solicit your capital. But before any of you consider engaging with them professionally or socially, I feel a profound moral obligation to illuminate exactly how they conduct their business and treat human beings. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the elite crowd. I tightened my grip on the microphone. Just 3 days after my modest wedding to the man standing beside me, these 4 individuals ambushed us at my late grandmother's house. They gleefully handed me a formal eviction notice demanding that we, along with an innocent 10-year-old boy, vacate the premises in exactly 72 hours so they could bulldoze the property for a superficial vacation rental. My mother coldly told me to go live in the slums because I had supposedly married a broke loser. Gasps of pure horror echoed from the wealthy patrons. Some of the most prominent philanthropists in the room stared at Cynthia and Thomas with expressions of absolute unvarnished revulsion. When we quietly accepted our fate, their malice only escalated. I continued, my voice ringing with undeniable power. Brittany and Cynthia crashed my workplace, a local public high school. They dragged in a box of filthy, moth-eaten garbage, loudly declaring it was a charity handout, so my new stepson would not look like a beggar. But that was not enough for Jamal. Utilizing his position as a credit director, he maliciously blackmailed the school district, threatening to pull massive banking sponsorships unless my principal terminated my teaching contract immediately. The room erupted in angry, disgusted whispers. Corporate executives glared at Jamal, who was now curled into a tight, trembling ball on the marble floor, completely unable to hide from the devastating exposure. And when their recklessly leveraged real estate ventures inevitably collapsed under the weight of their own staggering incompetence, I delivered the final fatal blow. They tracked me down to a roach-infested apartment. They did not come to apologize. They came to demand that I divorce my husband and sell myself to an elderly banking executive to bail out their toxic debt. When I firmly refused, Jamal presented forged legal documents, aggressively demanding I manipulate my husband into taking the fall for his own catastrophic financial fraud. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted from shocked disbelief to pure radioactive hostility. The elite society they had worshipped and ruthlessly clawed their way to impress was now looking at them like they were an incredibly contagious disease. By exposing their sickening greed, their extortion tactics, and their willingness to frame an innocent man for federal crimes, I had officially and permanently blacklisted them from every single boardroom, country club, and social register in the entire hemisphere. Their toxic, arrogant empire was completely annihilated, burned to the ground by the very daughter they had so cruelly thrown away. The deafening silence that followed my speech was abruptly shattered by a guttural, enraged roar. Jamal snapped. The crippling terror that had kept him pinned to the marble floor violently morphed into a blinding, rabid frenzy. He scrambled to his feet, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated madness. He lunged toward the crystal podium, his hands curled into violent fists, screaming that I was a lying, manipulative fraud. He did not make it more than 3 steps. The elite private security contractors moved with lethal, terrifying speed. 4 massive men in dark suits converged on him simultaneously. They tackled Jamal with brutal, unforgiving force, slamming his heavy body hard onto the polished marble floor. The sickening thud of his impact echoed through the grand ballroom. He thrashed and kicked wildly, spitting furious curses, but the guards effortlessly pinned his arms behind his back, pressing their heavy knees directly into his spine to completely neutralize the threat. Before the shocked crowd could even process the violent takedown, the heavy brass doors of the ballroom swung open once again. The atmosphere in the room shifted from stunned disbelief to absolute chilling severity. A team of stern, unsmiling men and women wearing dark federal windbreakers marched into the glittering venue. They bypassed the velvet boundary ropes, displaying shiny gold badges that gleamed under the massive crystal chandeliers. They were economic crime detectives, operating with swift federal authority. The head detective, a tall man with a hardened, no-nonsense expression, walked straight toward the chaotic scene unfolding at our feet. I stepped back, allowing Ian to move smoothly to the forefront. My husband adjusted his bespoke tuxedo jacket, radiating absolute untouchable power. He looked down at Jamal, who was currently pinned to the floor, gasping for air. Ian's voice was low, but it carried a razor-sharp, freezing edge that cut through the remaining tension. He calmly informed Jamal that earlier this afternoon, Vanguard Horizon's legal team had forwarded every single piece of his fraudulent, desperate financial application directly to the federal authorities. Ian revealed that the heavily doctored real estate portfolios, the toxic bridge loans, and the explicitly forged signature attempts had been meticulously packaged and handed over to the Financial Crimes Division. Jamal's reckless, arrogant attempt to secure a corporate bailout had actually been a fully documented confession to massive federal fraud. The head detective stepped forward, completely ignoring the opulent surroundings. He looked down at Jamal with absolute professional contempt. He loudly declared that Jamal was officially under arrest for severe corporate fraud, criminal extortion, and malicious financial manipulation. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around Jamal's wrists rang out like a final devastating death knell. The arrogant credit director, a man who had proudly worn tailored suits and mercilessly belittled my supposed poverty, was roughly hauled to his feet. His expensive rented jacket was torn, his tie was ripped aside, and his face was slick with terrified, humiliated sweat. Jamal began to scream. It was not a defiant, angry shout, but a pathetic, high-pitched wail of absolute crushing despair. He begged my sister for help. He screamed for Thomas to call his expensive corporate lawyers. He wildly pleaded with Ian, sobbing uncontrollably, as the federal detectives forcefully marched him through the parting crowd of disgusted billionaires. The city's highest elite watched with freezing, silent judgment as the disgraced banker was dragged kicking and screaming out of the grand ballroom, his entire career and freedom violently extinguished in front of their eyes. The horrific reality of the situation crashed directly into my father. Thomas stood frozen near the velvet ropes, watching his golden son-in-law being hauled away to federal prison. The fragile, debt-fueled house of cards he had desperately tried to protect was completely obliterated. The catastrophic realization hit him with physical, devastating force. Every single asset he owned, his sprawling suburban estate, his luxury vehicles, his entire business portfolio, and my late grandmother's cherished home were all officially seized by ruthless creditors. I was absolutely, undeniably ruined. Thomas gasped for air, his face turning an alarming shade of pale gray. He clutched his chest, his eyes rolling back slightly as a massive, paralyzing panic attack seized his entire body. His knees buckled under his heavy frame. He collapsed violently against a tall glass cocktail table. The table tipped over, sending expensive champagne glasses shattering onto the floor as my father slid down the marble pillar, weeping and hyperventilating in a pathetic, crumpled heap. Cynthia dropped to her knees beside him, screaming for anyone to call an ambulance. She frantically grabbed the arms of passing socialites, begging for assistance. But the wealthy patrons simply stepped back in profound disgust, actively avoiding her frantic, grasping hands. They looked at my parents like they were toxic radioactive waste. Then the final spectacular implosion occurred. Brittany, who had been standing frozen in sheer terror, suddenly snapped. The golden child watched her arrogant husband get hauled off to prison and her parents collapse in total bankruptcy. The glamorous elite life she had aggressively flaunted to humiliate me was gone forever. She turned on Cynthia and Thomas with a sudden vicious explosion of pure, unhinged fury. Brittany began shrieking at the top of her lungs, her voice tearing through the silent ballroom. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at her weeping parents. She aggressively blamed them for pushing Jamal to secure the fraudulent loans. She screamed that their obsessive, sickening greed had completely destroyed her perfect life. She stomped her scuffed, rented heels on the shattered glass, hurling vile, hateful insults at the very people who had coddled her since birth. The perfect, superior family dynamic they had so proudly paraded around to mock me had violently cannibalized itself, leaving nothing but broken, desperate people turning on each other in a spectacular display of absolute, unrelenting karmic justice. I watched their spectacular ruin with an incredibly profound sense of absolute, overwhelming peace and liberation. The sense of liberation settling over me was absolute. The glittering crowd of billionaires and titans had backed away, forming a wide perimeter around the catastrophic wreckage of my biological parents. The massive crystal chandeliers overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the pathetic scene unfolding on the polished marble floor. Brittany was shrieking wildly, her voice cracking as she aggressively kicked at the shattered champagne glass. She cursed our mother and father for destroying her perfect life, ignoring the fact she had gleefully participated in my cruel eviction just months prior. Thomas remained crumpled against the overturned cocktail table, his face a terrifying shade of pale gray, clutching his chest as the reality of his total financial annihilation paralyzed his breathing. Cynthia looked around the massive ballroom, finally realizing that the elite society she worshipped was staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Desperation completely overrode her lifelong arrogance. Her eyes darted frantically towards me, locking onto the multi-million-dollar diamond necklace resting heavily against my collarbone. She saw the absolute undeniable power radiating from Ian as he stood firmly by my side. The mother who had coldly told me to go live in the slums suddenly scrambled across the slick marble floor. She threw herself forward, her expensive rented sequined gown tearing loudly at the seams. Cynthia fell violently to her knees right at my feet, her hands reaching out to grasp the hem of my midnight blue silk dress. Thomas, seeing his wife groveling, summoned the last of his failing strength. He crawled over the shattered glass, his rented tuxedo jacket stained and ruined. He collapsed onto his knees beside Cynthia, weeping openly in front of the entire city elite. They looked up at me with tears streaming down their pale, horrified faces. Cynthia aggressively clawed at my skirt, her voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail. She begged me to save them. She desperately pleaded for Ian to reverse the federal fraud charges against Jamal and reinstate the massive bailout funding. She cried out that I had to forgive them because blood is thicker than water. She swore they had always loved me deep down, frantically claiming that family must always stick together during difficult times. I looked down at the two miserable, broken people weeping at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, razor-sharp clarity. I gently but firmly stepped backward, forcing Cynthia's trembling hands to slide off my expensive gown. I looked directly into her desperate, bloodshot eyes, maintaining a posture of perfect, unyielding dominance. My voice echoed clearly across the silent, captivated ballroom. Family does not abandon you when you are broke, just to kneel when you wear designer. I delivered the final devastating blow with surgical precision. I told them that the blood running in our veins meant absolutely nothing when their hearts were entirely composed of pure, sickening greed. I calmly informed them that they were officially dead to me. I turned my back on their hysterical sobbing. I slid my hand through Ian's arm, and together we walked gracefully out of the grand ballroom. We left them groveling on the cold floor, permanently blacklisted from high society, entirely abandoned to face the brutal, inescapable consequences of their own malicious arrogance. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind us, completely sealing off my toxic past forever. 1 year later, the warm golden sunlight of early autumn filtered softly through the large bay windows of the deeply familiar kitchen. I stood at the marble counter pouring a fresh cup of coffee, breathing in the comforting scent of roasted beans and blooming gardenias. Ian and I had officially and legally repurchased my late grandmother's house straight from the bank's foreclosure auction. We did not bulldoze the cherished property to build a flashy, superficial vacation rental. Instead, we completely restored the beautiful, cozy home to its original, welcoming glory, upgrading the foundation while meticulously preserving the deep, sentimental warmth that my grandmother had always intended for me to inherit. The wealth that Vanguard Horizon provided did not change who we fundamentally were. It simply amplified our ability to protect the people we loved and aggressively dismantle the institutions of greed. Using the limitless resources at my disposal, I had proudly established a massive, heavily funded education foundation entirely in my grandmother's name. The organization was specifically dedicated to providing full-ride college scholarships to underprivileged, fiercely dedicated public school students. I spent my days actively reviewing applications, ensuring that brilliant, hardworking teenagers would never have to rely on predatory loans or suffer the crushing weight of systemic poverty just to achieve their dreams. I picked up my warm coffee mug and walked slowly out onto the spacious back porch. The wooden deck had been beautifully rebuilt, overlooking a sprawling, perfectly manicured green lawn. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing, a profound, unshakable smile spreading across my face. Down in the vibrant green grass, Ian was running wildly, chasing a laughing, energetic Leo. The 10-year-old boy sprinted toward a large oak tree, dodging his father's playful attempts to tackle him. The sound of their pure, unadulterated joy echoed clearly through the crisp autumn air. Ian finally caught Leo, scooping the boy up and spinning him around until they both collapsed onto the soft grass in a fit of breathless laughter. I watched my husband and my stepson, feeling a deep, overwhelming wave of absolute gratitude wash over my soul. I had finally found my true, authentic family. We were bound together not by obligation or superficial status, but by genuine unconditional love and mutual respect. We had faced the darkest, most vicious betrayal imaginable and emerged entirely victorious, building a peaceful, impenetrable fortress of happiness. Meanwhile, my biological family lived out their days trapped in a cramped, miserable trailer park. Stripped of their arrogant pride, they drowned in the exact crushing poverty they had once so cruelly mocked. Sometimes the most profound lessons we learn come from the people who were supposed to protect us, but chose to break us instead. Diana's journey is a powerful reminder that blood does not automatically make someone family. Real family is built on mutual respect, loyalty, and standing by each other when the chips are down, not just when the bank accounts are full. We often tolerate emotional abuse from our relatives because we are conditioned to believe that family ties are unbreakable. But walking away from toxic people is not a failure. It is an act of profound self-preservation. When you stop measuring your worth by the impossible, ever-shifting standards of people who thrive on your insecurity, you finally make room for genuine love to enter your life. Ian's choice to hide his wealth was the ultimate test of character, one that Diana passed simply because she valued a hardworking father and his son over material comfort. Her true triumph was not gaining access to a billion-dollar empire, but realizing she had the strength to orchestrate her own justice and walk away from her abusers without a single regret. True wealth is finding peace and building a sanctuary with those who love you for exactly who you are. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your own peace? How did you find the courage to build your chosen family? Please share your story in the comments below, and if you found value in this journey, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and redemption.